Pasta is a very popular dish today, but in the 18th century, it was something that was very new to people in America. Some people were excited about pasta, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, but most people really didn't have very much experience with it. There are a few newspaper advertisements advertising pasta from Italy, but the vast majority of people didn't get to have it. We didn't have the kind of machinery or even the knowledge to understand what pasta really was. Thomas Jefferson spent time in Europe in the late 18th century, and there he had experience with pasta, and he so enjoyed that he wanted to bring that back to America. He had someone go look at pasta machinery, how they made pasta, and he got descriptions, and he even drew diagrams of pasta machines. I want to experience pasta made on a machine just like Jefferson had.
After looking at the painting of Jefferson's pasta press, it seems pretty simple. A hardwood frame with a metal pot that the dough will go into, and then a large wooden screw acting like a vise to press the dough through the holes in the bottom to make little noodles. From the painting, I've come up with a design that's fairly simple. Hardwood posts and rails that are mortise and tenon together. The size we're going to make is a tabletop size. That's all we really need. In larger applications, they were the size of a room and actually used horses and a winch to crank the big wooden screws around to force the noodles out in a mass quantity, a whole lot at once. The measurements that we're going to use to make this is roughly 2 feet by 1 foot, leaving about 6 inches on the bottom for our dish or bowl or whatever we would need to catch the pasta when it comes out of the press. The frame is fairly simple, just wooden pieces, mortise and tenon pegged together, but the actual working part of this, what makes it all come together, is the large wooden screw that'll act like the big vise coming down and forcing that pasta through. Now these wooden screws are large, so it's going to be a challenge, but I think I've come up with a nice solution and just the right tools to get the job done. To make the plunger part, we need to turn this on the lathe, and then this whole end here has to be just the right diameter to fit in the screw box to turn this into threads all the way along. And that is done with the screw box. Now in the time period, these screw boxes were matched to the tap. You make the tap, you make the screw box, and they go together. There weren't common sized threads. You couldn't just go to the store and buy one. If you had one made, you had the other made, and they went together all the time. This screw box here has a cutter, and when this piece is turned into it, it'll cut threads, and it'll thread itself all the way through. This is a tap that has an advancing cutter. You need these in order to make both threads for this working piece. We have our screw box, the threads and the cutter on the inside of it, greased up, ready to go. It'll take a little bit of time, but a little bit of patience, and we'll have some nice threads to work with. And we'll just start it in nice and easy by hand. As it gets farther in, it'll get a little tougher. Once the threads start biting, it'll kind of draw itself in. We have our threads cut all the way up to this point, but you notice this piece of wood here, the collar, the threads are only cut up to there. So if we want the threads cut all the way up, we need to back this out, take the collar off, and then run it back down again, and then we can cut the threads all the way up right against this shelf here of the plunger. Our two cross pieces here are both the same size, but one will have a smooth round hole for the cup to sit in. The other one will have a smaller hole that will be threaded, and that's the one that's going to be a challenge. They're both marked on center, so our next step is to bore a hole, and then we can take this tap here that we've made, put it in there, and that'll tap out and make our internal threads. Now the cutter here has a little set screw that can push it up each pass going back and forth through, making that cutter stick out just a little bit more and taking just a little bit more of a cut. Our hole is bored, and and it will be inserted like this. Then the collar will go right down up against the piece of work. And depending on what kind of work you're doing, if it's fine finish work, you're going to want to clamp this. If it's a rough frame like what we're using, you can use screws. And once it's held into place, we can start driving the tap through. Each pass will make just a little bit more of a cut. And once again, a little bit of patience and persistence, and then you'll have our internal threads. This is kind of the mid-range. This is a cheaper way to make this size of thread as opposed to having an all-metal giant tap to make this size of thread. Here, our cutter is just a very small piece, so it's also economical. The bowl is made out of a mild steel, and we had to just hammer the flange over, and we did it cold. As long as you're careful, you can do that and it's just fine. The top flange flanges out, so it'll catch into the cross piece of the frame. The bottom flange is flanged in just a little bit, so it'll catch the bottom plate that has the holes in it. The bottom plate that fits inside of the inward flange on the bottom of the bowl is made out of steel as well. And I used a jeweler's saw to get a nice, fine, intricate cuts. So we have perfect noodles coming out of the bottom. Now once we get all of these pieces done, we're gonna season them just like a cast iron skillet. The final assembly is pretty easy. We have mortise and tenons with wedges. So you put it together, you hammer the wedges tight, but then also if you need to store it away in a tight spot, just knock out the wedges and it packs down pretty small.
The recipe we'll be using to test out this pasta machine is Jefferson's recipe. It goes something like this: 6 eggs, yolks and whites, 2 wine glasses of milk, 2 pounds of flour, a little salt. Work them together without water very well. This should make a softer dough than some of the other recipes. Hannah Glass has a recipe. She says make it really stiff. That's for rolling it out and cutting it. Since we'll be extruding this, it needs to be softer. We're gonna do a half a batch. I'm gonna try whole wheat flour and we'll see how that turns out. I've used it before and it's worked out pretty well. We're gonna mix in a little bit of salt, dry, and I'll just mix this with my hands. And then we'll take 3 eggs and 2/3 of a cup of milk, and we're gonna whisk that together. And then pour it into our flour mixture and mix it up with my hands until we get a nice, smooth dough. All right, Brandon, you made it. You do the honors.
Alrighty. Well, what I'm expecting to happen is the dough will come out in the shapes here that we cut out. One little problem that we might run into is if it squeezes up out of the top here, but depending on the consistency of the dough, we'll see. It might work out.
It does look like a pretty good fit, so.
We've got some squeezing action.
Let's do it. It's looking good. So I didn't know exactly how they were gonna come out, and it probably depends on the dough as to what the consistency is like. They do wanna naturally curl, but I wanna go ahead and slice them up a little bit and curve them so that we get some elbow on them. William Short wrote to Thomas Jefferson on February 2nd, 1789, "I procured at Naples, according to your request, the mold for making macaroni. It is of a smaller diameter than is used in the manufactories of macaroni, but of the same diameter with the others that have been sent to gentlemen in other countries. I went to see the macaroni made. The machinery for pressing as used at Naples is enormous. The price they told me for fitting up one of these machines with a mortar, etc., was the value of 100 louis d'ors. The depth of the mortar is about 20 or 24 inches. I observed that the macaroni most esteemed at Naples was smaller than we generally see at Paris. This is the part of Italy the most famous for the excellence of that article. We had one of the best cooks in Naples, and yet he never could give us macaroni that we thought edible." Brandon, thanks again for making that incredible pasta machine. This, I hope, turned out great. I mean, I haven't tried this particular pasta recently, but it smells really good and that cheese melted really nice, so it should have an amazing flavor. Let's find out. Oh, those are some chunky noodles, let me tell you. Woo, so good. And if you make it like this, don't forget the nutmeg. It really sets it off. So good, so good. Thanks again, Brandon.